The dark road stretches out before them. For a long time, the energy in the car is calm, comfortable, and there's no reason for him to think he's in danger. Then it all changes in a second. His passengers are no longer the sweet, down-on-their-luck couple. They are predators, and he is their prey. This is True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to episode 171, A Dangerous Adventure. This week's sponsor is When Change Happens, a podcast series about ordinary South Africans coping with extraordinary changes in their lives, and hosted by legendary journalist Ruda Landman. Subscribe to Change in One Generation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Iono, or go to changepodcasts.co.za for more information. Since 2019, True Crime South Africa has been telling the stories of the victims of violent crime in South Africa. The podcast is independent. That means no big or even little corporates fund it. And that's just the way I like it. And it's the only independent podcast in South Africa that consistently charts in the top 10. Keeping a podcast like this going is time-consuming. And for the most part, it remains a one-woman process. It's me. I'm the one woman. You, yes you, are the reason this podcast continues to flourish and help bring in tips on missing person and cold cases. If you'd like to help keep the show running, please consider supporting our sponsors, signing up to Patreon or PayPal, follow the show on the socials, as the kids say, and share it with your fellow partners in crime. You can find our social links and learn more about our sponsors at True Crime South Africa/donate. Shout out to this week's Patreon and PayPal superstars. A huge thank you goes out to Lindiwe Mnisi, Tanya Stearman, Christu Janse van Rensburg, Mayabongwe Roda, Arena Fantona, Stace Kenny, Michelle Nordia, Sarah Doyle, Kathy Brooke, Thurlow House, and Fiona for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much, everyone. Patreon supporters get one additional exclusive episode a month, a shout-out on the pod, and other exclusive contents, including Q&As with me as and when it's available. It's a minimum of $1 a month. I think you should do it. Please. And thank you. Kiaba. This episode was first published on the Patreon feed in July 2023. Certain sections have been edited to make it more suitable for the general feed. Crimes in which a couple are the perpetrators are relatively rare. But when they happen, the psychology behind them is always fascinating. This week's episode is a case I hadn't heard about until I stumbled upon it doing research for another case. I'm always fascinated, and I think many of you are too, with killer couple dynamics. I've covered a few of these cases over the years. Charmaine Phillips and Peter Grundling is one case that springs to mind, which is actually very similar to this one in dynamics. These types of cases are always difficult to figure out because there's often a very clear power dynamic lean, at least from the outside. But the more you hear about each party's actions, you begin to wonder how much each was actually a leader and how much a follower. And then there's the added confusion of the possibility of coercive control and manipulation, and how that can make someone look like they're a willing participant. But when coercion is present, consent and rational thinking is often removed. So, if you're looking for clarity, you might need to look a little more. but I can give you the facts and maybe some of my own thoughts, and you can decide for yourself. In researching this case, I used the book Fatal Females by Mickey Pistorius, as well as a few media articles I could find. So, let's get into episode 171, A Dangerous Adventure.
The following episode may contain sensitive material, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, or graphic descriptions of injuries to victims. If you feel you may be triggered by such material, please consider this before accessing our content. To access trauma counseling or services, please see the helpline information on our show notes.
Ansun Putter spent the first 12 years of her life in what she thought was a pretty happy family. She was a very ordinary young girl, well-behaved, happy, and a good student according to her parents. When she turned 12, though, her parents sat her down and told her that they were divorcing. Ansun would later say that her life had fallen apart that day. In the months and years that followed, her parents battled against one another for custody. When she was spending time with her mom, she heard only bad things about her dad, and the reverse was true too. She eventually said she couldn't take being the pawn in her parents' battle anymore, and considered suiciding on many occasions. Ansun managed to make it through this difficult time, although it certainly seemed to have a long-term effect on her. She would later report a deep desire, as she was getting ready to matriculate, to get away from everything in her life, in her hometown of Carletonville. And soon, the opportunity to do just that would present itself. Albertus LaRue, who was known as Bertie, was 29 years old when he arrived in Carletonville. We know very little about his life before that, as, interestingly, later social worker reports delivered in court seem to focus almost solely on Ansun's life experience. His actions and behavior, reported by many people who came into contact with him besides, but also including Ansun, would speak to a young man who'd already lived a pretty rough life. He would admit in court that he had been a lifelong petty criminal, but always seemed to be lucky enough to get away with things. Bertie never stayed in one place for very long. For some people, traveling and living in different places is just a way of life. But for Bertie, it seemed to have more to do with running away from the trouble he'd gotten himself into in the previous place he'd lived. Bertie also seemed to be quite the storyteller, and as a result, no one really knew who he actually was. He used different names with different people. Almost everyone had a different backstory for him, and maybe that too played into his constant moving around. It's hard to keep up with the lies. Bertie met Ansun soon after he'd arrived in Carletonville. For her, he created a new persona, perhaps one he knew would impress a young woman 11 years his junior, and someone who'd been in a small town most of her life. When Bertie spoke with Ansun, he often slipped into a French accent. This was, he said, as a result of all the time he'd spent in Europe as a world-renowned chef. Ansun was impressed. Here was a man who knew something about the world. He'd lived an exciting life, it seemed, and she couldn't believe he was paying her the attention that he was. She knew the age difference would have been a problem with her parents, but Bertie said they didn't need to know how old he was. Slowly, Ansun, who'd never really considered sharing anything but the truth with people, was drawn into a new realization. Maybe, just maybe, you could be whoever you wanted to be. And you didn't always have to tell the truth. A few white lies never hurt anyone, right? Ansun's parents, though, seemed less than impressed with her first boyfriend. They pressured her to end the relationship, but having matriculated and no longer feeling like she had to live under her parents' rules, Ansun made a different decision. She and Bertie were leaving Carltonville. Bertie told Ansun that he'd been hired as a chef by a restaurant in George, and she could work there as a waitress if she'd like. Their new life seemed to wait across the country. And with very little explanation to her parents, Ansun packed a bag, and in November 2000, she and Bertie were off. Ansun would later say that she'd seen the whole thing as one big adventure. In her very young mind, she was with the man she loved, and they were going to tour the country and meet new people. If you've ever been close to someone who isn't terribly good at telling the truth, you'll know that feeling of sitting in a room with that person and others, and the liar starts telling stories that you know are absolutely not true. It's a moment that can really mess with your head a little. You definitely don't want to embarrass the person by calling them out, and they sound so convincing that you might even begin to convince yourself that perhaps you aren't remembering the facts clearly. And eventually, maybe that this person seems so exhilarated when sharing their lies that it almost doesn't seem fair to stop them. I've come across a few people in my life who lie about the most bizarre things. It's almost always to make themselves look better or to garner sympathy. But when these people are close to you, maybe your family member or a partner, and there's some sort of power dynamic in their favor, it's almost too easy to just let them do their thing. And then your perception of the world becomes skewed. But you just play along because the cost of calling them out is too high. On the other hand, I've also known couples where both are like that. Although, as an outsider, I could tell that the stories that were being told were outright lies and exaggerations, both members of the couple played into that dynamic. They each actively supported the other's lies. It's probably almost impossible to tell which dynamic was actually playing out with Ansun and Bertie, but the age issue alone tells me that there was significant power on Bertie's side. Ansun was also completely out of her depth. She had no access to money, had never been outside of Carltonville, and was living for the first time with no parental guidance. So, perhaps when she started to realize that Bertie was making up a lot of what he was saying about his life and creating even grander stories for others, she felt it was just easier to go along with it. Perhaps in some way, his stories were exciting to her, just adding to the adventure, all part of this amazing fantasy she was living. Either way, she soon realized that the world-renowned chef had no more money than she did. They hitchhiked and spent nights in bus stations on the way to George. It was definitely not the start to the journey that Ansun had envisioned, but she reasoned it was all part of the adventure, surely. By the time the couple arrived in George and reported for duty at the restaurant, Ansun had immersed herself in Bertie's world. She was now calling herself Candy, and Bertie was calling himself Ricky. The owner of the restaurant must have thought they'd hit the jackpot when Ricky, aka Bertie, began telling them about all the countries he'd cooked in, how he'd published multiple best-selling cookbooks, and how he was actually worth millions. But he and Candy had decided to give back to the community instead of enjoying a luxurious lifestyle, and they'd been traveling the country teaching housewives to cook. Unfortunately for Bertie, It's very difficult to fake actual cooking skills, and the couple only worked in the restaurant for a few months before they were asked to leave. Bertie, of course, framed this as him choosing to move on, because the restaurant just wasn't good enough for his excellent culinary skills. It would become clear that while Bertie and Ansun were in George, many things were happening behind the scenes in their life. Ansun would later claim that it was during this time that Bertie became very abusive toward her. She said that he would threaten her and her family if she ever tried to leave, that he had raped her, and would hold her at knife point for hours at a time. Also during this time, though, the owner of the restaurant they worked at would say that Ansun was often wearing very expensive jewelry that she said Bertie had given to her. Their boss said that there was no way the man could have afforded it on his salary, and although at the time it sort of reinforced his lies about being a millionaire, on reflection, it seems that these items may have actually been stolen. Ansun and Bertie would never speak about any crimes they committed during this time and wouldn't be charged with anything either. But as Bertie would make very clear later on, he'd never really lived life on the straight and narrow, so it definitely seems that there are many crimes which this couple could have been responsible for before they left George. With the couple, though, money seemed to be easy come, easy go, because by the time they left the restaurant, headed for Cape Town, they were broke again, and hitchhiking or illegally sneaking into the backs of unlocked trucks to get further along their route for free. Ansun would say that during this time, Bertie's abusive and controlling behavior had increased, and she claims that he tried to get her addicted to drugs to further control her. Up until this point, it seems that their crimes were mainly petty, perhaps shoplifting or other thefts, but not violent. But it would seem that even then, Bertie at least, or maybe both of them, had the means with them to start committing violent crimes. Ansun would say that when they'd left Carltonville, they'd been on the road to George, and they'd gone via Ermelo at one point. Bertie had stopped in at an acquaintance he had there and emerged with a gun. She hadn't seen him use the gun, but knew he still had it. Sometimes he would give it to her to carry, as he believed that women were less likely to be searched than men. When the couple left George, they were able to catch a few lifts, and eventually on the 25th of February 2001, they found themselves at a petrol station in Beaufort West. The town is one of many on the N1 highway that become a thoroughfare for people travelling to Cape Town or in the opposite direction, to Bloemfontein or Johannesburg. Bertie and Ansun had picked the perfect spot to wait for another lift, as there was always someone passing through there. But it would emerge that this time, at least Bertie, and maybe both of them, had something else in mind entirely. Johan Stror was travelling through Beaufort West to Johannesburg. It was a trip he made regularly, and he would admit that sometimes when he felt safe to do so, he would pick up hitchhikers. He liked helping where he could, and having some conversation for parts of the drive didn't hurt either. Johan pulled into the petrol station in Beaufort West just before nightfall on the 25th of February. He was waiting for his car to be filled with petrol and stretching his legs on the forecourt when a young woman approached him. The girl looked incredibly young to be out on her own, and Johan was immediately concerned about her welfare. She introduced herself as Varushka, but he would later discover that her real name was Ansun Putter. The girl explained that she was headed to Cape Town and asked if she could drive with him. Johan said he was headed in the other direction, unfortunately, and the girl seemed to not know what to say to this, and disappeared back into the night. Shortly afterwards, though, as Johan prepared to pull out of the petrol station, she reappeared, this time with a man who looked close to his age. The man introduced himself as Verushka's boyfriend, Vanshu. Johan would later discover that his real name was Bertie LaRue. Vanshu, aka Bertie, told Johan that he was actually heading to Three Sisters, a town just further up the N1 and in the same direction Johan was going, and he'd appreciate it if he could give him a lift. Johan was momentarily confused that the boyfriend and girlfriend were at the same petrol station, headed in opposite directions, and that it seemed the girl had now decided she'd just abandon her alleged initial destination and go wherever her boyfriend was headed. But after chatting with the couple for a little while, he pushed the concerns to the back of his mind. They seemed nice enough. The man was quite charming and talkative, and Johan thought he might help to pass the time as they drove. So he agreed to give them both a lift to Three Sisters. Ansun got into the back seat with their bags, and Bertie got into the front seat beside Johan. Johan said that Ansun was very quiet for most of the ride, and Bertie barely stopped talking. He would occasionally reach back and rub Ansun's leg, but other than that, there was no communication between the pair during the drive. As they neared Three Sisters, Johan said that Bertie suddenly made a phone call. It would later be discovered that this phone call was faked, and there was no one on the other end, but Johan didn't realize this at the time. When Bertie got off the call, he told Johan that if he didn't mind, they'd prefer to continue on with him until Colesberg, which was the town after Three Sisters, as he had a friend that would be meeting them there. Johan agreed. It was no hassle to him, as he was going through there anyway, so he continued on. On a particularly dark stretch of road just before Colesberg, though, everything changed. Bertie, who'd been chatting away, suddenly became very quiet and reached his hand into the back of the car. Johan thought he was just rubbing Ansun's leg again, as he had numerous times throughout the trip. But this time, when his hand came back into view, he was holding a gun. Bertie pointed the gun at Johan and told him to pull off onto a dirt road which was out of view from the main stretch. Johan did as he was told. He told Bertie he could take whatever he wanted, but he should please not hurt him. Bertie told him to shut up and walk to the back of the car. There, he popped the boot and shoved Johan in. Johan felt the car start moving again. Bertie and Ansun drove a few kilometers before pulling off the road again. Bertie popped the boot and instructed Johan to get out and start walking. Johan held his hands in the air and slowly walked into the dark field on the side of the road. With every step he took, he realized that he was getting further and further from safety. He begged Bertie as he walked not to hurt him. He began to cry and was certain that at any minute he was going to be shot. Eventually, Bertie told Johan to stop walking. They were far out from the road. There was not a house or car in sight. Bertie told Johan that he didn't want to shoot him because he was a nice guy. Johan felt a fleeting moment of relief, but then sound exploded around him, and he felt a piercing pain in his head. He fell to the ground, realizing he'd been shot. Bertie LaRue fired another shot at Johan as he lay on the ground. It missed him, but since the man had already been shot in the head and he was motionless,
Bertie likely figured he'd done the job and walked back to the car, leaving Johan there in the dirt. He got into Johan's car and he and Ansun drove off. As the headlights disappeared into the distance, the road to Colesberg once again fell silent. Night hung like a heavy blanket over the field, where just moments before, Johan had begged for his life, and shots had rung out. Johan Stror lay face down in the dirt. For a long time, he was sure his attacker would come back to finish the job. Perhaps he was standing just in the shadows, waiting for Johan to give away the fact that he was not dead. After several long minutes, though, the stillness of the night was broken by Johan's gasps. He tried as long as he could to stay completely still, playing dead just in case his attacker was still watching, but he knew he needed to get help, and soon. He knew he'd been shot in the head. He had no idea how he was possibly still alive, but he could also feel warm blood seeping down his neck and back, and he wasn't sure how long he'd be conscious for. Johan Stror would walk 4 kilometers that night, before he eventually stumbled against the front door of the first house he found. The occupants were stunned to find a man with a severe head wound collapsed at their door, and as he began to drift in and out of consciousness, they called an ambulance and the police. Captain Farnes Olivier was called to the hospital as Johan was being prepped for surgery that night. By some miracle, the bullet had not killed him, but there was significant damage that needed to be repaired. Olivier had just a few minutes with the victim before he was rushed away and managed to get a few important pieces of information in that time. He immediately went to the petrol station in Beaufort West and got a copy of their CCTV footage. From there, Olivier was able to capture stills of the interactions between Johan and the couple who'd hijacked and tried to kill him. These were distributed to the press in the days that followed, and soon every newspaper was carrying the story of the murderous young couple they dubbed Bonnie and Clyde. During this time, Bertie and Ansun were on the run. They'd used Johan's vehicle for several days, and then when they started to see the newspaper reports about their crime and realized police would be looking for the vehicle, they abandoned it. I do have to wonder what their respective reactions were when they discovered that Johan Stror had survived. I think that would say a lot about each of their true intentions and mindsets. Bertie had undoubtedly wanted to get rid of Johan as a witness, and despite him telling the man that he didn't want to shoot him, he did so when the words had just left his mouth. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure Bertie, at least, would have been rather angry that he hadn't managed to complete the deed, although later he would claim differently. Ansun's response is a mystery. One would hope that a ripple of relief would have run through her, but the prosecutor would later put an opinion forward that she was as intent as Bertie in wiping out witnesses to their crimes, so I guess we'll never know. As the days ticked by, Captain Olivier used every path of investigation he could to track the suspects, but they seemed to have disappeared into thin air. He knew that it was just a matter of time, though, and the press coverage not only improved his chances of someone spotting them, but it also helped to protect future victims by warning the public that a dangerous couple was on the loose. The media played along and continued to publish articles and the accompanying CCTV stills for days in a row. Johan Stror remained in hospital recovering from the gunshot wound. It would take many, many months for him to be able to recover many of his fine motor skills. His eyesight was badly affected for a long time, And with every day that passed that his attackers were not arrested, he lived in fear that they would come back for him. But they didn't. Instead, on the 2nd of March 2001, officers at Strand Police Station were more than a little taken aback when a young couple walked into their station and announced that they were the Bonnie and Clyde that was being sought, and they were there to hand themselves over. Bertie LaRue and Ansun Putta were arrested and charged with robbery, attempted murder, and illegal possession of a firearm and ammunition. Ansune's parents were alerted to her arrest, and in the weeks that followed they would travel to meet with their daughter. Bertie and Ansun were of course separated after their arrest, and each was asked to provide their version of events. Very often in these cases we see the couple in question, although seemingly being deeply committed to one another before and sometimes shortly after their arrests. When it comes time for trial, a rift seems to have formed, which usually remains present going forward. This could happen for several reasons. If, and I put emphasis on that if, there is a coercive control situation going on and one partner has been acting without true consent, they may now feel free to speak the truth and go against the other partner. In return, the abusive partner may simply see no further worth in that partner, and they're back to saving their own skin. That's one possibility. Another is far simpler. Love is wonderful and passion is powerful, but prison time is a pretty big wake-up call that will make almost anyone start to reconsider their feelings and how far they really want to go with their partner. Defense attorneys may suggest that in order to get the least prison time possible, it would be important to emphasize their own innocence or lower level of complicity and highlight their partner's actions instead. And once these defenses start being presented in court, the love bubble pops pretty quickly. In the case of Bertie and Ansun, by the time their trial started in Victoria West in November 2002, the couple were clearly prepared to go up against one another from the get-go.
Ansun pleaded not guilty to all of the charges against her. She insisted that she'd essentially been held against her will by Bertie and had not willingly contributed to any of the crimes she was accused of. Bertie, on the other hand, pleaded guilty. He acknowledged that he had committed the crimes, but this guilty plea meant that he would testify in Ansun's trial, which would proceed, and his testimony would clearly show an intent to try and minimize the jail time he would get in an eventual sentencing. Ansun's plea and testimony would center around much of what I've shared already, that she claimed Bertie had been abusive, threatening and coercively controlling, and that she'd essentially been a prisoner and unable to escape his clutches or do anything to stop the hijacking and attempted murder of Johan Stror. She said that the night of Johan's attempted murder haunted her every single day, and she'd been traumatized by the entire ordeal. When the victim himself took the stand, his testimony was incredibly powerful. Johan became emotional as he recalled how he'd begged for his life, and Bertie had fired the shots at him, regardless. He spoke of the abject terror he'd experienced, lying in the dark, face down, wondering whether they were coming back to finish him off, and then the arduous 4-kilometer walk to safety and help, and never knowing whether he'd actually make it in time. He also testified how he'd been impacted physically for a long time after the crime and had tried to continue working, but found it extremely difficult with the sight issues he struggled with. Emotionally, he said the injuries were far more profound, and he wasn't sure if he would ever fully recover from the trauma.
All present in the court were clearly touched by his testimony and the strength and bravery it had taken for him to survive. As far as Ansun's role in this crime is concerned, one witness would provide an interesting and very contradictory version to her own. When Bertie LaRue took the stand, most present wondered whether he would support Ansun's claims of her not having been complicit or blow them out of the water. And from the first words he uttered, it was clear he was going to attempt to do the latter. He started as far back as their first meeting, claiming it had been Ansun who'd been the aggressor in their relationship. She had initiated their sexual and romantic relationship, he said, and although he'd been in relationships before, he had to admit that he found her level of obsession with him intoxicating. He then said that it had been Ansun's idea that they should run away together. She wanted to elope, he said, and didn't want her parents standing in their way. He claimed that she'd been the one who'd arranged the gun collection when they were en route to George, and it had been her idea to use aliases when they started working at the restaurant. He admitted that he was easily led because he'd been a petty criminal all of his life, so none of the ideas he claimed she came up with were particularly abhorrent to him. That was, he said, until the night of the 25th of February. On that night, they were supposed to be sleeping over in Beaufort West, and he thought they were just going to continue on with their hitchhiking to Cape Town the next day. But he said Ansun had had different ideas. She did not want to sleep over there, and insisted that she was tired of hitching rides and she wanted a car of their own. Bertie claimed that Ansun had come up with the idea to hijack the next person that gave them a lift, and he was to get rid of the driver so that he couldn't identify them. Bertie insisted that everything he'd done that night was on instruction from Ansun, and although he said he didn't feel fearful of her, he would never have come up with those ideas himself, and he was certain his petty criminal career would never have escalated to attempted murder without her. He further claimed that when they'd seen the articles in the newspaper about Johan Stror having survived, Ansun had been livid with him and told him that he'd messed everything up, and now he needed to go to the hospital in Bloemfontein where Johan was being treated and finish the job. Bertie claimed that he had eventually managed to convince Ansun that this was a terrible idea, because Johan would undoubtedly be protected by the police, and they could never sneak into the ICU undetected and get out without being arrested. He claimed that he'd never done anything abusive to Ansun, and that he'd been shocked to hear her allegations of violent treatment, threats, and rape. He told the court that he understood that she'd tried to use these claims to get herself off on the charges, and he forgave her for her lies. He went on to say that since his arrest, he'd done nothing but try to turn his life around. He claimed he'd helped prison warders to remove drugs, illegal phones, and other contraband from the prison cells, and that he would continue to try and live a better life. He claimed that he was haunted by what he'd done and offered up thanks many times a day that Johan had survived. Ansun's defense attorney, of course, shot back at every claim he made, essentially putting it to him that his claims were typical of an abusive partner who would never take responsibility for his own actions and always try to shift the blame onto the abused party. And as the verdict and eventual sentencing would show, it's almost impossible to tell who was telling the truth here. So both were punished. Certainly not equally, but the judge didn't take into account any form of coercion on either side. For Ansun, he accepted that her youth may have played a role, but that was the only piece of mitigation he accepted. In 2003, Ansun Pita was found guilty on all charges. Bertie LaRue had of course admitted guilt, and this was accepted by the judge. Despite his admissions and claims of not having been the mastermind, he was given the heaviest sentence as the one who'd pulled the trigger on Johan Stror. Bertie was sentenced to 36 years in total for the charges of robbery, attempted murder, and the illegal possession of a firearm and ammunition. With the sentences being served concurrently, he would be required to serve an effective 20 years. Ansun Pita was sentenced to 26 years for the same charges. The judge said that the only mitigation he took into account was her youth, and the fact that she had not physically pulled the trigger herself. Everything else, in his opinion, she was equally responsible for. Her effective sentence would be just 5 years less than Bertie's, at 15 years.
Ansun's lawyer immediately requested the opportunity to appeal, which was denied, and both were taken down to begin serving their sentences. The impossibility of determining exactly which version of the story was the truth exists, I think, because the real truth is some mixture of the two. Although it might be very difficult for us to believe that an 18-year-old girl with almost no life experience could mastermind a spree like this and manipulate at any level a man more than a decade older than her, it is not impossible. Of course, it feels far more likely that the other party, a man who admittedly had been a career criminal, a serial liar, and seemingly quite manipulative in many other aspects, was the responsible party here. I will admit to finding many of Bertie's statements in court quite grandiose. His sudden change of heart in wanting to be a contributing member of society, and his alleged forgiveness of Ansun for what he claims were her lies against him, don't sit well in my gut. The prosecutor in this case did allude to specific instances of what seemed like outright manipulation and control from Ansun. But I also think it's important to understand that at this point, 20 years ago now, we didn't really understand the nature of coercive control, and it certainly wasn't a crime, as it is now in some countries across the world. Sadly, not yet in South Africa. I don't know what to think. I mean, I know what I tend to think, because I can't help but remember that history does tend to repeat itself. And while an 18-year-old girl with murderous intentions is not in any way a complete impossibility, a coercively controlling and abusive man is far more common, at least in the cases we see. But that's for you to decide. By now, both Ansun Pita and Bertie LaRue will be out of prison. Sometimes I cover cases where listeners actually know the offenders and or the victims, and they'll comment as such after I release the episode. I can only hope that both Ansun and Bertie really have seen the error of their ways, and that they're now living productive and successful lives back out in society. Even more so, I hope that Johan Stror, who suffered such an indescribable trauma, has fully healed and in some way been able to rebuild his life. I think his bravery and strength is one of the most important takeaways from this case for me. I can't even imagine what he must have gone through. And perhaps for him, it didn't really matter who was more or less responsible for what happened to him, because they were both there. They both played a role. And very possibly, if it weren't for both being in the same place at the same time, in some alternate reality, he may have just been able to fill up with petrol and drive out of Beaufort West
having no idea the horrific ordeal he dodged. If you'd like to hear more victim-focused true crime content, please subscribe to True Crime South Africa on Spotify or the platform you're using to listen right now. If you're looking for something still related to real-life stories, but often with a more positive slant, you can check out my new podcast series, I Lived Through This. You can follow both podcasts on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, thank you for your support, and I'll chat to you soon.
Thanks again to this week's sponsor, When Change Happens. To hear amazing stories of change, go to changepodcasts.co.za. I'm sure you'll enjoy the show.